Okay, let's start then our first talk in the Garrod Seminar Research Series in the Lent term. You are very welcome, and we're happy to hear from you, and thank you for joining us. A bit of organizational issues. First of all, please send your questions to me, and we'll either ask your questions ourselves to the speaker, or you will unmute yourself and ask the speaker directly. And the second, this session will be recorded. Please take this into account. I'm very happy and have such a pleasure to welcome Ayana Flewellen as our first speaker in this in the long-term Garrod Research Seminar Series. And a big introduction of the Dr. Flewellen. She's a Black feminist, an archaeologist, a storyteller, and an artist. She's a co-founder of the Society of Black Archaeologists and sits on the board of Diving with a Purpose. Dr. Flewellen is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Riverside. And the topic of today's presentation of Dr. Flewellen is the Society of Black Archaeologists, envisioning a diverse and inclusive discipline. Please.
Thank you so much, Sultanate. And thank you for Kim as well, who unfortunately isn't here to join us today, for really the invitation and also to share this work on this platform with so many scholars. So give me 1 second as I share my screen. And can you all see that, or do you see the speaker screen?
No, it is visible. Everything is good.
Okay, thank you so much, technology. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again to Kim and Sultanate for the opportunity to share this work of the Society of Black Archaeologists. It's really an honor to be a part of the Garrod Research Center seminar series, and in the company of amazing, phenomenal scholars whose work is really transforming this discipline around the world. So before I really dive into the presentation, I wanted to take a little time just to share a bit more about me and my research. As Sultanate mentioned, I'm a Black feminist, an archaeologist, a storyteller, and an artist. My research and teaching interest are shaped by and speak to Black feminist theory, historical archaeology, maritime heritage conservation, public and community engaged archaeology, processes of identity formation, and representations of slavery in the African diaspora. I've done work in Tanzania, Nevis, the Southern United States, and I'm currently the co-PI of a project based in St. Croix, one of 3 islands in the US Virgin Islands. And my scholarship really focuses on sartorial practices of self-making among African diasporic women in the Circum-Caribbean from enslavement through freedom. And within this work, I explore how quotidian sartorial practices Black women engaged were central to the ways they navigated the precarity of African diasporic life. Through studying these iterative practices of dressing the body, the ways African diasporic women were able to chart a path through the day-to-day racial sexual oppression they endured and spaces of possibility they created within dire circumstances becomes legible. And I welcome the opportunity to connect and share more about this research. Central to this presentation, I did want to highlight again that I'm a board member of Diving with a Purpose, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation and protection of submerged heritage resources by providing education, training, certification, and field experience to adults and youth in the fields of maritime archaeology and oceanic conservation. And finally, as it relates central to this presentation, I'm the co-founder and the president-elect of the Society of Black Archaeologists, which will be the focus of my presentation today. To start off this discussion, I really wanted to place this presentation in historical context. So amid the social upheaval and civil unrest, Americans are being confronted with the hypervisibility of racial injustice and anti-Blackness that undergirds our society. The ripples of social unrest felt around the world have a profound impact on the discipline of archaeology. On June 25th, 2020, I, as the co-founder of the Society of Black Archaeologists, co-organized and chaired a webinar titled Archaeology in the Time of Black Lives Matter. This webinar gathered over 1,700 people from around the world to witness 5 Black archaeologists and a museum professional discuss permutations of anti-Black racism within the field and how we envisioned a discipline created or committed rather to eradicating racial injustice. And however, the hypervisibility, I should note, of racial politics within the discipline stretches back farther than 2020. And it's important to highlight the work of scholars that rest at the foundation of this ongoing fight to create a path for a more diverse and inclusive field. With that in mind, I want to point us to the work of Maria Franklin and her piece titled, "Why Are There So Few Black American Archaeologists?" where in 1997, she wrote that less than 1% of archaeologists identify as Black or African American. And she attributed this primarily to institutional racism that has deeply impacted the choices we make regarding careers. Today, the exact number of African Americans employed as archaeologists in America is unknown. Our best estimates can be gleaned from 3 needs assessments conducted by the Society of American Archaeology since 2003, which you can see here on the slide. And using this data as a proxy, the percentage of people who identify as African American has remained at less than 1% of the total number of American archaeologists, growing at a slow pace of about 0.1% roughly every 5 years. Decentering the United States for a moment, based on Catherine Jobbert's 2019 piece, Archaeology in Canada, an analysis of demographics and working conditions in the discipline, 90% of archaeologists in Canada were white, and 4% were either Black, Indigenous, or Hispanic, with 6% being biracial. Based on Kenneth Atchison and Doug Rock McQueen's 2013 work, Discovering the Archaeologist of the United Kingdom, 97% of archaeologists in the UK are white. These numbers reflect how the lack of diversity within the field, which is symptomatic of systemic racism, is a global phenomenon. And this is the real backdrop to which SBA was founded. And I debated whether to start this discussion with our incorporation as a nonprofit in 2018 or the founding of the organization in 2011. And I decided to start with the latter because I want to share mainly for any students in the audience the work that's possible as an undergraduate or graduate student that can have a lasting impact on our discipline. So in the spring of 2011, I was sitting in a car next to Justin Donovan, my fellow co-founder, and we were making a 2-hour drive down from Tallahassee to Gainesville, Florida, after attending a Black psychology meeting at Florida A&M University. At the time, Justin was a first-year graduate student, and I was a senior undergraduate majoring in anthropology at the University of Florida. The Black Psychology Conference was an eye-opening experience for both of us. We witnessed the brilliant scholarship that psychologists of African descent were producing, and also the support systems they forged for themselves as a collective within a field that was predominantly white. Knowing intimately feelings of isolation and exclusion within the field of archaeology, we left the Black psychology meeting really craving a space like that within our own discipline. During that car ride, Justin and I talked about what it would be to actually make this space possible. And it was during that car ride that we first conceived of the name, the Society of Black Archaeologists. That very week, we set up a meeting with Dr. Faye Harrison, a renowned anthropologist and author of Decolonizing Anthropology and outsider within Reworking Anthropology in the Global Age, who, to our great fortune, was teaching at the University of Florida at the time. And we asked Dr. Harrison about the origins of another organization called the Association of Black Anthropologists, housed under the American Anthropologists Association, to strategize a plan forward for SBA. Justin and I started with a list of names and a few archaeologists of African descent who we knew, and we asked them to then give us names of who they knew. And we had a small network of about 30 individuals scattered throughout the United States. In January of 2012, at the Society for Historical Archaeology's annual meeting, we met for the first time. And this is actually an image that we took that day. My highlight from that meeting was sharing space with Teresa Singleton, who was the first African-American woman to receive her PhD in archaeology in the United States. For many that attended that first meeting, it was the first time we found ourselves in a room at an academic conference with faces that just mirrored our own. It was the first time that some had uttered stories of discrimination they encountered in graduate school or while working for cultural research management firms. From that meeting, we left with a mission to transform our discipline by creating a network of archaeologists dedicated to providing a support system for archaeologists of African descent to excel, and uplifting critical theory rooted in African and African diaspora theory studies that really prioritize community engaged archaeological scholarship. And on the slide, you have a couple of images from SBA meetings at the Society for Historical Archaeology over time. And this is our last meeting when we all were able to meet in person in January of 2020. So since those early days, we have officially become a nonprofit organization with 92 professional and student members based in the US, the Caribbean, South America, the UK, and on the continent of Africa, along with 27 institutional members, including the Society for Historical Archaeology, the Archaeological Institute of America, and the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. Our mission really centers the histories and material culture of global Black and African communities in archaeological research. By providing a strong network, mentorship, and educational access, the SBA works to resolve the ongoing systemic exclusion of Black and African scholars and communities from the field of archaeology. And the SBA aims to provide avenues of engagement and training that will prepare Black and African scholars and communities to be active participants in the documentation, excavation, preservation, and interpretation of Black and African heritage. And our mission envisions a field really predicated on a practice of anti-racist archaeology. And achieving a diverse and inclusive discipline begins with a commitment to engage concretely in the longstanding problem of systemic anti-Black racism by examining our own practice, whether through personal or disciplinary activism, teaching and research, and within academic settings, as well as within cultural research management. From the June 25th, 2020 webinar that I discussed in the opening of this presentation, I, along with the co-organizer, Zoe Crossland, an associate professor at Columbia University, and the panelists, Dr. Maria Franklin, an associate professor at the University of Texas, Austin, Dr. Justin Donovan, a postdoctoral scholar at Vanderbilt University, Dr. Alicia Odewale, an assistant professor at the University of Tulsa, Dr. Alexander Jones, the CEO and founder of the nonprofit Archaeology in the Community based in the DC, Maryland area, and Sion Wole, a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, have co-authored a forthcoming piece that outlines a pathway towards a sustainable field rooted in anti-racism. Within this piece, there are many, many, many gems, but I'm going to highlight the four phases we outline that are necessary to building an anti-racist archaeology and the work SBA is doing now in pursuit of that future. So phase one is really the demolition phase, and that's dedicated to identifying and breaking down barriers to racial equity in archaeology, really centering on the need for representation. Phase 2 is the foundational construction phase, which is dedicated to building an anti-racist foundation and decolonizing our scholarship within the discipline. Phase 3 is the rebuilding phase, dedicated to creating the house and frame for a new practice of archaeology through expanding our understanding of race, racialization, and racism. And the fourth phase is a shared commitment phase, which is dedicated to sustainability, which is only possible through intentional mentorship. And as you will see, SBA has projects aligned with all three phases. While these seem like discrete boxes, you can almost imagine them as overlapping at various points in time. And the ongoing work that we're doing is simultaneous, and it's creating that future that we envision now. So really thinking about phase 1 and the demolition phase in SBA. So one of SBA's flagship programs has been the Oral History Project. And the goal of this project is to capture and highlight the history of African descendant people in the field of archaeology. These life history style interviews provide a peer view into the experiences of archaeologists, identifying barriers such as lack of mentorship, financial inaccessibility, and overt encounters of racism, as well as support systems such as foundational epistemological backgrounds and Black and ethnic studies, scholarship opportunities, and positive mentorship experiences that have shaped the career trajectory of Black archaeologists over time. 8 of our 10 interviews are available online, and we're actively still collecting them to this day. We are also in the process of surveying our membership to gather more qualitative and quantitative data regarding the needs of African diasporic archaeologists and how, as an organization, we can better service those needs. Additionally, through an institutional collaboration with the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, Cornell University, the Wintergren Foundation, and Sapiens, under the leadership of Adam Smith from Cornell, we've gathered archaeology center directors from across the country to concretely address the lack of diversity and inequity in academia. And from this, we've really been able to put together collective surveys that are being assembled to really gather data on the toxicity of disciplinary culture, as well as issues around accessibility to field school training experiences. And gathering this data is the real first step in assessing what precisely needs changing as we map our path forward. Additionally, within the organization, we are actively breaking down geographic and language barriers, connecting archaeologists of African descent across the globe. I've mentioned our membership earlier. Moreover, I should say, we currently have members such as Gabby Hartman, who I saw was actually here with us today, who are actively gathering Francophone archaeologists of African descent on both sides of the Atlantic. We also have strong membership of archaeologists and heritage professionals dedicated to Egyptology. And more recently, we've witnessed the founding of the European Society of Black and Allied Archaeologists by Peggy Bernache, a core member who's actually featured in one of our oral histories. But she's the core member of SBA that's based in Scotland. And then within phase 2, the foundational construction phase and SBA, the goal within this phase is for people to establish a shared commitment to anti-racist praxis by really leveraging systems of systemic privilege to bring about systemic change. One of the ways SBA is engaged in this work is through our online programming. The triptych event that really featured the webinar, Archaeology in the Time of Black Lives Matter, began a week before with a teach-in at Columbia University, where several students and faculty gathered to discuss readings related to racial politics in the field. And that was really an initiative brought about by Zoe Crossland. The 2 weeks following the panel, 65 scholars from around the world gathered in a workshop that produced a comprehensive resource guide that's now available online through the SBA website that really outlined steps in organizing and activism, capacity building, recruitment and retention, pedagogy and curriculum development, community engagement, field school and research opportunities for a more just field. And this workshop was really aimed at producing a foundation for decolonizing our field from a myriad of vantage points. So it really rests as the foundation for more work to be done. And phase 3 is the rebuilding and planning phase. And phase 3 is really dedicated to creating the sort of house frame of a new practice of archaeology through expanding our understanding of race, racialization, and racism. And one of SBA's earliest initiatives was organizing panels and symposium at the Society for Historical Archaeology, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and the National Association of Black Studies to really promote the cross-fertilization of Black studies within the discipline of archaeology. And we believe that the discipline will only grow through the expansion of our epistemological toolkits. More recently, we had an SBA-sponsored symposium that was chaired by Dr. Alexander Jones that once again gathered archaeologists that were really, diving deep into Black studies and Black critical theory and how it's informed and impacted their research. And even more so, we've also had a panel through the Association of Black Anthropologists at the annual AAA conference that also talked about the use of Black studies, theorization within the field to really expand, once again, our epistemological toolkits that really makes this or really breaks barriers in the research that we're conducting. And building on those early days, we're currently in partnership once again with the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, the Cornell University, the Wintergren Foundation, and Sapiens, producing a year-long webinar series that uplifts Indigenous and Black epistemes and pedagogy within the field. Through this, we're providing informal educational opportunities with scholars, as well as artists whose practice is rooted in heritage, to converse about a range of topics from repatriation, where we had Sonia Adelaide, Michael Blakey, fantastic scholars who are really the forerunners doing work in this field, to the defacement of colonial and racist monuments, as well as community-based cultural stewards that are doing this work in their home, at home. And really, phase 4 is a commitment dedicated to the sustainability. It's the commitment dedicated to sustainability, which is truly only possible through sustained mentorship. And it's within this phase that SBA hosts its largest programming. So I'm actually going to turn the volume off for that one. But our flagship award-winning field school, which was started with seed money from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, is the Estate Little Princess Archaeology Field School. And at the Estate Little Princess Archaeology Field School, we host a 1-week field school in partnership with Archaeology in the Community to train youth on the island of St. Croix and archaeology methods to foster job placement skills needed for heritage work on the island, as well as generating an overall sense of environmental and cultural stewardship. And through this partnership, we've not only been able to host this for 3 ongoing years, but with the support of the Smithsonian, as well as Archaeology in the Community, we've been able to hire youth that have gone through that program to come back year after year as paid interns to also train students. Additionally, within this program, we also host the University of California's HBCU Initiative Grant, which funds students from historically Black colleges and universities to spend 5 weeks with us on the island of St. Croix, conducting archaeology alongside us. This is particularly important because most historically Black colleges and universities do not offer anthropology courses, let alone provide students educational access to archaeology curriculum. Our students receive a $3,000 stipend to attend this program. Their application fees are waived for graduate school programs if they apply to any 4-year PhD granting program in the University of California system. And if they are accepted, they receive 4 to 5 years of funding. And we currently have one student who's completed the program twice. So she's come back, she came back with us 1 year. And she's now a first-year graduate student in the anthropology department at the University of California, Los Angeles. So we're seeing concrete results from this consistent dedication to mentorship. And finally, we also have our flagship partnership with Diving with a Purpose and the Smithsonian Slave Wrecks Project, which we're working to generate a pipeline that really trains terrestrial archaeologists of African descent to do maritime archaeological work. And the really fantastic aspect of this program is that with Diving with a Purpose and the Slave Wrecks Project, they're actively engaged in multiple theaters around the world, really looking at ships involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and are actively training scholars, not only in the United States, but around the world to really do this work at home. And we currently have 4 participants that are in this program. The video that you're currently watching is actually one of the Diving with a Purpose youth training programs, which is in partnership with the National Park Service, where students who are in high school from 9th to 12th grade are really hands-on learning how to do maritime archaeology work. And these views are similar to the programming that DWP hosts with their adult training program. And it's also a part of the ongoing work that I'm a part of in this pipeline to gain maritime archaeological training to do more of this work in the future. So I would be remiss to say if I did not bring up the actual labor involved in this work. Oftentimes, the labor of really decolonizing our field falls upon scholars of color to really do the heavy lift. And SBA certainly is an example of that. So much of the work that we are doing is in benefit of the field at large, but the center of it really is dedicated to creating academic pathways for archaeologists of color to really excel in this field. And the future of SBA, in addition to our ongoing webinar series with the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, the Wintergren Foundation, Sapiens, and Cornell University, we also continue our State Little Princess archaeology program. We have plans to institutionalize a mentorship program within the organization for SBA members. We have ongoing weekly and bi-weekly meetups for members where we're able to share new and exciting work and get feedback. There's also opportunities for writing groups and the like. And we also have our upcoming Black and Archaeology Week, which is a social media campaign that is in partnership with collaborators in the Caribbean, Brazil, as well as the UK, that really highlights the experience of people of African descent in this field, and you can find that on all social media platforms. Additionally, we also have a lot of upcoming media work that I can't quite highlight at the moment, but we're definitely here reshaping representation of archaeology at a grand scale. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I look forward to taking questions and really being in dialogue around how how we're all transforming and working towards transforming this discipline.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flewellen, for the fantastic talk and fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Please just feel free to unmute yourself and ask. So if I can ask you a question, Dr. Flewellen. As I understand, it's a quite a strong emotional bond between what you research and your ancestry heritage, and how do you cope with this? How it affects your research? Does it give you strength? Does it distract you somehow?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Sultanat. I definitely, it would be impossible to study the transatlantic slave trade and not find yourself impacted by that work. My dissertation research specifically, which is the foundation of my book project right now, focuses on dress and adornment practices of Black women post 1865 in the United States, so after the Emancipation Proclamation. And the women in Texas are directly connected to my ancestral lines. I have ancestors that date back to Texas in the 1850s. So there's an immediate connection to, and a resonance with those Black women, and in a real sort of crave and desire to understand the living conditions as well. I think part of what really gives me strength and being in conversation with other scholars who are also doing work on the African diaspora, specifically related to the transatlantic slave trade and the experiences of enslavement, is really focusing on our work that centers on life. And I think so much of what we can center on really focuses on the very real dire circumstances and precarity of Black life that structured the 15th, 16th, the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th, 19th centuries. And I think what is even more beautiful within that are the ways in which people were creating ties with one another, were building communities with one another, were communing together, were dressing their bodies in this very intimate fashion, and still proclaiming that while the society at large saw them as commodities, they saw value in themselves. So that kind of work of focusing on life in the midst of the sort of enclosure of social death really undergirds the work that I do and makes it possible to continue forward.
Thank you very much. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions.
Hi, I have a question, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
I was just thinking about what you said about usually the work of decolonizing archaeology is falling to people of color and the society. And I just wondered, kind of like, as a white person, like, as in, what can I do as an individual to help? What can we discipline of archaeology to help? Like, how can we contribute, and what could we do? Because I think all of us are starting to be aware of the issues and understand them, trying to understand them more. But then it's kind of, that's wonderful, but what can we do?
Yeah, absolutely, Catherine. Your question is spot on. And I wish that one of my colleagues, Zoe Crossland, was here, because she's a fantastic example of someone who is white, who is doing the work. And part of doing that work is really standing alongside and getting in the sort of grittiness of these conversations, but also like doing the real work of creating programs and creating pipelines and creating pathways of accessibility. So for instance, that what came out of that SBA webinar series, our webinar, the Archaeology in a Time with Black Lives Matter, I highlighted that there was a whole resource guide that was produced that addressed a myriad of ways in which archaeologists, white, Black, or other, can really be a part of this transformative work. And it starts from like very simple things, from like being able to have these conversations in, have these conversations with yourself, have these conversations within your classroom settings, have these conversations within your faculty meetings, to really doing the active work of decolonizing your syllabus, for instance. My department right now is in the sort of gritty work of looking at our core curriculum and really calling ourselves to task and asking ourselves, who are we canonizing in the field of anthropology at large and within our subdiscipline of archaeology, who are the people that our students are reading, and how can we expand their epistemological foundation to include scholars who are doing fantastic work around the world, from women and gender studies to Black and diaspora studies to other ethnic and area studies departments. And that kind of work can be done at an institutional level within your department. The Archaeology Center Directors Collective that I mentioned earlier, which is under the sort of direction of Adam Smith out of Cornell and partnership with all of us, is really focusing on the ways in which in these academic settings, these archaeologist center directors can have conversations not only about curriculum development, but addressing issues of toxicity and culture when it comes to the culture that our students are experiencing out in the field, be it racism, sexism, and the like, as well as, what sort of accessibility barriers in terms of financial accessibility barriers do we need to break down as faculty members in our departments to allow more students to have access to these opportunities. And of course, more than anything, I have the fortune of having been trained by a Black woman, Maria Franklin, but the majority of archaeologists around the world are white. The majority of students of color who are in this discipline are being trained by white archaeologists. So being able to have cultural competency in race and racial sexual politics, like that is actually central to being able to create an inclusive environment to actually mentor your students. So creating those sort of pipelines and addressing these issues around mentorship, I think, are central to the work that white scholars can be doing in this discipline.
The next, please, John Robb.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk, Ayana, and I learned a lot from that. I have a question that's sort of similar to the previous one, which is quite a lot of archaeologists work in areas that may be historically removed from something like an African-American experience. And I find it interesting that it sounds like you're, like a lot of the organization you're describing had its roots in the Society for Historical Archaeology, say, rather than the Society for American Archaeology. And in that sense, is it a little bit of a trap to assume that these issues are only relevant to parts of archaeology where there's a historical experience of issues such as racial oppression or things like that? I mean, for example, what if you work in Viking archaeology or in North American prehistory or something like that? I can imagine a decolonized human evolutionary studies of the deep past that would be really interesting, but what do you think would be the useful directions for people to go in regardless of the actual area of archaeology they work in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, John. It's a fantastic question. And I want to highlight that initial webinar, once again, it brought in 1,700 participants, over 2,500 people registered for it. And they were archaeologists around the world who were doing work in a variety of different regional and thematic sort of silos. So I think what brought that experience really sort of brought up and highlighted the fact that these are ongoing conversations that are happening discipline-wide. And the history of SBA finds itself in the Society of Historical Archaeology, predominantly because it was started by Justin and myself, who were historical archaeologists, and that was our academic conference at the time. And we've since really realized that our membership has expanded beyond that of the Society for Historical Archaeology, precisely because all of our members don't do historical archaeology. And a really great example of that would be Kathleen Sterling's work, who is an SBA member who does work, who applies a Black feminist lens to prehistoric archaeology and like these in a deep understanding of early Homo sapiens, and really calling us to question the dichotomous nature inherent sometimes in the biases we bring to our interpretation practices of past material culture. So there's a way that the work that we're doing and the calling in of really expanding our theoretical sort of foundations really roots itself in critical theory that aims to break apart and really question what we sometimes hold as dear, regardless of your sort of regional, once again, or thematic silo, to really think through more critically of our interpretation practices, but also to think through more critically of who we're engaged with in this work. Oftentimes the conversation around the inclusion of archaeologists of African descent or other non-white archaeologists centers on whether or not you are doing work that immediately relates to these people's racial, ethnic, cultural heritage. But that's not always the case. And being able to actually critically engage your scholarship and invite a myriad of students into our work environments, but also, center the fact that this work, which is so deeply rooted in the past, has an immediate impact on the present and on present populations that are in these areas, is central to this work of a larger decolonizing practice within the discipline. I hope that gets a little bit at your question, John.
Oh, sorry. Justin, Donovan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? Okay, if not, then I can ask you, can you please tell what it was like to do this work as a graduate student, and any advice you have for graduate students?
Yeah, thank you so much, Justin, for that question. Once again, Justin Donovan is one of the co-founders for the Society of Black Archaeologists as well. And doing this work as a graduate student, it was really a matter of figuring out how to sustain myself in this discipline. And I feel like the foundation of that work of sustainability as a Black woman who identifies as queer as well, it was really important to have a support system in place for me. And that's really what SBA became. And I remember my first experience, attending a Society for Historical Archaeology meeting, and I was able to count the number of Black women, perhaps on one hand, in that space. And I think rather than like feeling discouraged around it, it was a reason to gather us and to create a collective and a critical mass. I think additionally, it was a lot of extra work. Justin and I started the Estate Little Princess project through the Society of Black Archaeologists when we were both graduate students. And my dissertation research focused on a site in Texas. His graduate research focused on a site in Ethiopia. So we were regionally in two very different spaces. And we came together and we're like, okay, we want to have a post-PhD project that really centered on the goals and mission of SBA and really allowed us to create a platform for scholarship that we wanted to do in the future. It was a lot of work, and it was unfunded work very early on. These first sort of meetings that we had where we flew down to St. Croix and partook in organizing meetings with community members to really gauge what needs needed to be met, what interest there was, and research questions and things of the like, took a lot of extra work. So that's what I mean by the kinds of labor that students are, that folks are doing. So that, I don't know if that really gets at that question, but I think in terms of advice for graduate students, is to really know that the largest shifts that have occurred in academic spaces have always come from students. It has not been from faculty. And a core example of that in the United States is the onset of the Black Studies movement in the mid-1960s that were led by Black students at these institutions, demanding that there be curriculum that addressed the Black American experience. Those sorts of movements start with students. And I feel like oftentimes we don't give a lot of credit to the value of that work and of that initiative, but it creates waves in our field. It really creates the waves.
The next question is, do you have any particular reading recommendations for a jumping off point for white scholars further learning?
I definitely would direct you to the SBA resource guide. Within that resource guide, because I can't like list out all these different readings, but within that resource guide, there are actual syllabi that are dedicated to a decolonizing archaeological practice. Within those syllabi are a myriad of readings from, as I mentioned, Faye Harrison's seminal work on decolonizing anthropology to Cheryl LaRoche and Michael Blakey's social politics within historical archaeology to more recent work by phenomenal scholars like Sarah Gonzalez in really indigenous archaeologies with Sonia Adelaide. So within that resource guide are these readings that can really jumpstart that conversation, not only for yourself and your students, but can also be the space where you create teach-ins within your department as well to do larger sort of informal educational spaces.
Danica, maybe it's better for you to unmute yourself and ask your questions, please.
Sure. So my question, kind of building on what Justin's question and what you were saying. I mean, I agree. I think I typed this before, but I think more change does come with, it comes from students and it comes with numbers. But I'm also worried about the implications of recruiting more students of color to archaeology when we know the challenges and the issues that they have to deal with. So my question is kind of, how do we reconcile that and make it easier for them without exploiting their energy? Essentially, how do we support them instead of feeling like I'm asking them to support those of us already in the field when we in recruitment?
Yeah, absolutely, because you're absolutely right. The goal is not to further exhaust students, and I will be the first to say that as a student that was really headstrong about this work. It was easier because I was in an environment that fostered that dialogue and fostered that dialogue from both Black and white scholars as well. Like we talked to Faye Harrison, but my undergraduate advisor at the University of Florida was James Davidson, who is a white scholar who does African diasporic work, and is central to his scholarship are the racial politics involved in his research. So being able to actually create the environments necessary for this work to take place is part of the work that faculty need to be doing in support of our students. Sometimes it doesn't happen though, and sometimes I have two colleagues right now who are graduate students in a department where they do not have that support. And the really beautiful thing about SBA is that it becomes the outside space that could provide the support that your department might be lacking. So once again, the goal is not to be extractive, but I will say from a strategic standpoint, strategically as students, it is always better to be collective and to organize yourselves. It's very easy to break down one individual, but it's difficult to break down a collective, a movement. If I was not here, if Justin was not here, we set up SBA in such a way that it will continue without us. We actually don't need to be here for it to continue. So I also feel like part of the work of doing this as a graduate student is to strategize around it, which is why we had those initial conversations with Faye Harrison around what it looked like to start ABA. How can that be mirrored in archaeology? We also had conversations with some of the founding members like Teresa Singleton around the founding of the Gender and Minority Affairs Committee in SHA, and really thought through, well, what were the highlights, the pros and the cons, the pitfalls of that organizing practice, and what can we do that's different? Being able to do that kind of work, I feel like is key to the success, but also to the sustainability, not only of that movement space, but of us as scholars, and especially for when I was a graduate student. Yeah.
David Connolly, would you like to ask the question? I've seen your raised hand.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, that's been a brilliant seminar. I've been learning so much from this, and it's a question I have where it's about practical advice and also your own experiences. I made the fatal mistake of thinking that archaeology is a liberal profession, and so thought actually just promoting this seminar, it would be easy and everyone would be agreeable to it. What I discovered, to my shock and horror, was in fact that there is this systemic and deeply rooted attitude within some of my colleagues, even to the point where there was that old trope about what about a society for white archaeologists? And I was horrified by it, but I wonder, you must have actually dealt with this yourself within North America, and just how do you deal with it? How do you talk to colleagues regarding this?
Yeah, absolutely. As a graduate student, I definitely had a peer of mine when we were founding SBA who asked me directly, well, why do you need that? Like, what if I were to start a Society of German Archaeologists? And I was like, if you feel like German archaeologists are underserved and need to gather, you should do that. Like, you should actually do that work and do that labor. I will say that, you know, the issue, I feel like the issue sometimes with systemic racism is the pervasiveness of it, the ways in which it doesn't always have to be so covert, or rather overt and in our faces today as it was in the past. But very recently, as in earlier this year, a few weeks ago, during the plenary session for the Society for Historical Archaeologists, there was an incident where a senior scholar interrupted a white early career scholar who was speaking about disability justice. And the sort of the pushback is fierce. It really is fierce, you know? And I feel like having these initial conversations are hard. And I think I've been very fortunate to have scholars who are white, who have like raised their hands and said, hey, I can do that labor. Like I can do the labor of like talking to white scholars about how, you know, various actions are racist. And that is real work to be done. I feel like there, you know, as we're thinking about what kind of work needs to be done, there are a variety of different vantage points that have to be attacked simultaneously. And sometimes it's figuring out who's there to do that particular labor. So for instance, in conversations with a sort of collaboration between the Society of Black Archaeologists and the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, there were conversations around, well, where's the place of white scholars in both of our organizations? And also like thinking through, once again, in our phases for phase 2, how it is that white scholars can leverage the privilege that they have in this discipline to support these efforts. One of the ways came up was really thinking about tenure packages for early career scholars and what it means for early career scholars to have letters written by senior scholars that really validate and validate their work. That's like one very concrete way that people are talking about this. Another concrete way is really thinking about who's on the editorial boards of all of our academic journal publications, and really asking them, okay, who's an ally and accomplice in the work that we're trying to do to create a more sustainable and just field. So I think part of it is also trying to figure out what arenas we want to really wage this kind of work. And I will say that while, you know, the voices of you know, the folks who are angered by the shift in the field are loud. They're not loud. Like they are loud and they are present. The work that people are doing to transform this field, the fugitive spaces that people are creating that are now becoming more mainstream in ways, and mainstream in the sense that we're receiving funding to do this work. We're able to publish in top journals to do this work. We're able to have institutional recognition from you know, the Smithsonian, for instance, partnerships with the National Park Service, the NOAA here in the United States. The ways in which we're able to do that kind of work will speak louder and will reverberate louder and will have a lasting impact. And that's really what I put my energy and efforts towards. So it's really figuring out, you know, the kind of work that we need to do and doing it. So yeah.
Katie Draycott, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yeah, I guess I can. Thank you very much for a super talk. Shall I put my video on? It'll be less rude, won't it? I'm a classical archaeologist, and I just wanted to ask you if you know if there are a number of classical archaeologists of color that are gravitating towards the SBA, or that you know of. It's, you know, it's an even more sort of the percentages, I would say, are even smaller than in archaeology in general, and obviously it's something of concern to me. So it's just something I wanted to raise. Like, is anybody here, do they identify as a classical archaeologist, bearing in mind that of course the term classical is problematic?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question, Kathy. Right now we have one core member. Oh my goodness, her name slips my mind right now, Lord, but she is a classical archaeologist who's actually based in Jerusalem right now, and has done work with the Institute for American Archaeologists in that sort of regard. So the answer is yes. And there's also a part of that resource guide, someone also came across a variety, and this is not classical, but just thinking about silos that are sort of outside of the scope when people generally think about Black archaeologists and people who are doing archaeology on the African diaspora. There's a resource guide for archaeology of or archaeologists being done by Black Mediterranean archaeologists. So there are all these sort of like resources that have sort of come about and have been scattered in different ways. But if you want, Kathy, if you leave your email, I can put you in contact with that SBA member. Her name is on the tip of my tongue. So I'd love to. That
would be great.
Yes, so yes, it is. It's Vivian Langan. Yes, thank you, Michaela. Yeah. So in the chat.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions, please? You can unmute yourself and ask. If not, then thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much to Ayana Flewellen. It was a fantastic talk and so many questions. And we hope to see you all next Thursday on our second talk. Thank you.